All right, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to do a three-part talk today in which I'm going to identify a realization, show you how it's been realized, and then tell you how things could have been different. And the first part of this is just knowing how you know when something has been realized. Like, how do you know when something is socially constructed? And it's really just two pieces of this. The first one is that it's taken for granted and it appears inevitable. So there's a lot of these things like beauty standards, time, like our time consciousness. These are things that just are part of the water that we swim in, that they just appear like they just are there and that's just the way things are. But upon further analysis, you realize that they need not have existed in this way. That there are places in the world where they don't have clocks and calendars, and there are places in the world who keep time in totally different ways than we do. And there are places in the world who have totally different beauty standards than we do. So these things that seem like truths, like our beauty standards and our time standards, are actually socially constructed. They are realized. So today I'm going to show you how the self itself is a realization. And that's kind of a really deep idea. I'm going to take this a little step farther. Like, the way that we feel about ourselves is a realization. And the way that most people in the modern world think of themselves is with a certain set of characteristics. One is that we're vulnerable, we're somewhat afraid, we feel alone, and more than anything, we feel incomplete. And this is a constant feeling that most people in the modern world have. That most people in the modern world have this sense that I'm not quite there yet. I'll be happy when. I'll be successful when. Like, no matter what, it's not yet there yet. And so we feel somehow incomplete, and most of our lives are spent feeling incomplete. And I want to show you that this is actually a reality that's been realized, and it need not be this way. In fact, many of our ancestors probably never felt this way. And so this is going to be the story of the realization of these things, the alone self, the incomplete self, and the self as we know it. So let's start with part one then, that it need not have existed in this way. The best way I know to do this is to go to my friends in New Guinea and show you how they don't feel alone and afraid and vulnerable and incomplete. So let me just show you one scene that happened when I was there. They have this merita, or it's a pandanus fruit, that grows up on these trees like this, and it's this giant fruit. You can't quite see it underneath there, but this is what it looks like. This is the fruit. And you can't actually eat anything of this fruit except the sort of greasy outside of it. So what they do is they wash the outside, and it washes off this stuff that you'll see, kind of this juice that starts to fall off the seeds from the outside. This is really greasy and fatty, and they don't have a lot of fatty stuff in their diet, so this is like really, really big deal to them. This is really delicious. And then they just like squeeze this fatty stuff all over their food, so it creates like a sauce that they put all over their food. And sometimes a village will have a lot of this, and so this is the scene that you're going to see here, is that here we are in the village. This is the village I live in. And I'm just taking you inside the house here. This is like my family, very extended family here. There's Lazarus, my brother, Penny, my other brother. And they're all just sharing food and water. And this is basically how things go here, is that everything's shared within the village. But this day is a very special day, so we go out and we're just kind of hanging out. We've been told that a neighboring village is going to attack us. And so we're kind of doing these like little warm-up dances and things, and they're singing these songs. And then pretty soon, here comes the attack. And you'll notice that they are not armed with spears or bows and arrows. They actually have food, and they're going to attack us with kindness. They're going to attack us with food. And they literally run down the hill here and stuff it into our faces. So you see the kid there get blasted in the face. and this just goes on and on for about 20 minutes. And then eventually they grab like one of our main sort of leaders, like one of the most prominent men in the village, and they hold him up. Here they hoist him up. And this is just kind of taunting him and teasing him, preparing him for the challenge. And then they run off into the woods. And then our job is to follow them back to their village, and they've prepared a feast for us. And the idea is to see if we can actually eat all the food that they've prepared for us. And along the way, they've set up all these booby traps, so like trees are falling down on us, and we have to break through the trees that fall down. And then right outside the village, here we are actually breaking through a final barrier here. And just outside the village, their whole village gets together and does one last chant as sort of taunting us, like, yeah, just see if you can eat all the food that's behind us over here. And then we do our last final chant before we go into the feast. And then we go in and now we're going to actually try to eat all the food that they prepared for us. And what they prepared is this giant pit. It's like a swimming pool of food. So it's not the most appetizing to, like, say, a Westerner, but you'll see here off to the left, it's just this pit of food that we are surrounding. And you can see all the seeds along the side. That's all Merita seeds. And there's the pit of food that we have to try to finish. So it's like a baby pool of food, you might say. And so eventually my battery runs out here, and so I don't get the full film. But we get beaten. We can't eat all the food. The leader of their village takes his spear and he starts walking around really menacingly. And it looks like, if you don't understand the language, it looks like he's threatening us. Like, it looks very scary. But if you understand what he's saying, all he's saying is he's walking around and he points to people who have helped prepare the feast. He just says, like, you know, Ben prepared the ground, ho, you know, and then he walks the other way and he's like, and then he just like is constantly like thanking everybody for creating this big feast. And then he launches at us with his spear like he's going to spear us. And he says, I've knocked you down by serving so much. And we're all just laying there like after a Thanksgiving meal, like can't finish anymore, right? And the point of this kind of thing is that this is what they do with when they have too much. They don't have any way of showing off. They don't have any way of conspicuously consuming and saying, like, I'm wealthier than you are. The thing that makes the most sense in a situation like this, in an environment like this, is not to show off your wealth, but to give away your wealth. And so they're constantly giving away their wealth in big feasts like this. And what happens after this feast, of course, when we can't finish it, is that we go back to our village and we prepare a big feast for them. And it just goes back and forth like this. And it becomes a very different type of economy, and it creates a very different sense of self. The self is not someone who's trying to consume things and show people how wealthy they are or what their identity is or anything like that. It's a society melded around relationships and building relationships. And the best way to think about this is two different types of societies. One you might call a gift society, and the other one is a commodities-based society. And if you think about any one thing, like there's a pencil sitting here, anything could be a gift or a commodity. This pencil could be a gift if I just give it to somebody, then it becomes a gift. If I sell it to somebody, it becomes a commodity. And the important thing about that is the difference it creates in the relationship. If I give it to someone, it creates a different kind of relationship than if I sell it to somebody. And if you have a society that only operates on gifts, then their relationships are going to be different than a society that operates on commodities. So a gift, of course, is all about valuing the people. When I give it to somebody, it's about creating a relationship between us and creating a relationship between us. If I sell it to somebody, I'm just trying to make money, and the value of this pencil is not in the relationship it forms, but instead it's in the economic value. Like how many cents is this thing worth? So what happens then in a gift economy is it creates a sense of interdependence between people. They feel connected in some way by the gifts that they've given to other people, whereas in a commodity society, you get a sense of independence. So if you play this out in our triangle of beliefs, behaviors, and structures, we're actually realizing a different kind of reality here. If your everyday behaviors are around commodities, where you make money, you put money in your pocket, you go to the store, you spend money, those things become yours, you have a different sort of consciousness forming there about individualism and independence and so on. So the commodity-based society creates this sense of the individual, whereas a gift-based society, we've actually had to create a whole new word for this in anthropology, and this is the word dividual. It's a very strange word, but in societies that do mostly gift exchange, the people don't act like individuals in the same way that we act like individuals. They tend not to champion their own opinion. They tend not to try to dress differently or show off a different way of being. They're not seeking an identity. And so these people are actually more focused on relating to other people and focusing on relationships rather than their individuality. And so ultimately they create what you might call relational identity. They identify themselves with the relationships they have and the value of those relationships. So they will be much more concerned not with whether or not they're cool or people think they're a neat person. They will instead worry about whether or not they've satisfied their obligations to other people. They'll worry about whether or not they have strong relationships with other people. Whereas in a commodity-based society, we end up with what you might call portable identities, where the objects that we consume become symbols of who we are. And so I can actually look around the room and have some sense of who you all are as individuals just based on the clothes you wear. And you find this as you travel as well. Like you have a pretty good sense of who people are, but just based on clothes they wear. And then finally, what this ultimately relates to then is that in a gift society, you'll find that people tend toward minimalism. They try to consume very little and show off very little and end up giving away a lot. Whereas in a commodity-based society, you end up with what we know of as consumerism, where people are actually buying things to show people who they are, to show their wealth. But this has other consequences as well, as you'll see. So a gift society works only in very small scale. And this then is the story of humanity as we've shifted from a gift economy to a commodity economy. There's really no way to run a large-scale society through a gift economy. And so while our ancestors most likely lived in gift economies, we now live in commodity economies for the most part. So why did market exchange happen? Why did commodities happen? Well, first you have the growth of agriculture, and we've talked about this, the changes that come about with agriculture, that increases population. Once you have more population, you have specialization, division of labor. This is all things we've talked about before. And suddenly, if you are not making food every day, the food that you're going to consume, you have to go trade it with somebody. And so you need frequent exchanges. And those frequent exchanges eventually create markets. And so you have these market exchanges, and you can imagine what these look like when they first emerge as just markets in small villages. But eventually markets become much more complex, and we end up with supermarkets where the value of the things here are just simply a price tag. It's not about who made them or where they came from. There's no real strong relationship between the people who made them and the people who consume them. Oftentimes you don't even know who made them. And then of course you have these markets which are even more abstract and obscured, where it's not about human relationships at all. It's entirely about economic value. So how does this reality get realized? I can just to frame the picture here, we've talked about this as the triad of realization. And if we think like to, say, people in the Kalahari, like how do these people go from living on the land to being in a market economy? There's actually an interesting movie about this.
Kalahari, it's always Tuesday, or Thursday if you like, or Sunday. No clocks or calendars tell you to do this or that.
This is from The Gods Must Be Crazy, and it has like this nice little metaphor where a Coke bottle falls out of the sky.
Lately, strange new things sometimes appeared in the sky. Noisy birds that flew without flapping their wings. One day, something fell from the sky.
And this can seem kind of silly, like this is the whole premise of the movie. A Coke bottle falls and they have to figure out what to do with this Coke bottle. But this is actually a metaphor for real things that happen. And this is the surprising thing, is that these markets actually do go into places that are very remote. And even places like New Guinea, where there's no TV and no radio, no way you would think to advertise, Coca-Cola still sends advertising into these villages through actors like this.
There are 180,000 vehicles delivering Coke throughout the world every day. That sounds like a lot, but there are still cultures whose main beverage is, say, water.
Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola yan. What is Coca-Cola yan? No. Hey. You only pass. Em ai block em, you can throw more or what em? Em ai block me hả? Hey. You throw more yourself. You throw more. Em tak throw, okay? You pilih mo sa em. Pilih mo sa em. Kiss him now.
So this is like really amazing. I mean, that this happens, right? That Coke is actually advertising in these really remote areas. But there are reasons for that. The market has to expand. Coke has to expand in order to expand its profits. So essentially, here's why the market expands. A company like Coca-Cola or any other company seeks more customers. They want to elevate their demand. And when they do that, then a tricky little thing happens, and that is that the locals need money. So especially in a place like New Guinea or the Kalahari, you're going into these places where people live off the land. Suddenly, if you generate demand and they want your product, now they need money. The only way they can get money is to sell their land or their labor, and this is often what they do. And if they sell their land, then they actually end up completely reliant on the market. And so this is how the market, that now the people are not in a gift-based economy, they now shift to what has to be a commodity-based economy. They have to be reliant on the market once they give up their land and labor. And this has, of course, happened all over the world to this day, and this is what's generally created the world as we know it.
People consume more soft drinks than any other liquid, including ordinary tap water. If we take full advantage of our opportunities, someday, not too many years into our second century, we will see the same wave catching on in market after market, until eventually the #1 beverage on earth will not be tea or coffee or wine or beer. It will be soft drinks, our soft drinks.
But that's what any company wants, right? They want to dominate the market. And so they have these certain tricks of the trade that we see happening all over the world. If you go to, and a lot of you actually have been to developing countries, and what you find in developing countries is there are a lot of Western products, and oftentimes the products are very cheap or even free. So for example, if you want a drink of water in a developing country, the only drink you can find is actually some cheap version of a Coca-Cola product. Coke is often cheaper than bottled water, and if you can't drink the water, it's actually cheaper to buy the Coke. So you see this all over the world. You also see them actually eliminating local alternatives by competing with them. So in India, this is actually pretty explicit. In the late 90s and into the early 2000s, Coca-Cola started producing in India, and there are all these protests all over the country. You can see some of the signs here that say Coca-Cola quit India. And the reason why people are protesting is because they're actually buying up local groundwater supplies to make the Coca-Cola. And so people didn't have water to drink, but could only then buy the Coke. This is what it looks like.
These are the states which are facing drought every year. At the same time, when people do not have access to drinking water, Coca-Cola is buying up local wells in states of Maharashtra and Gujarat. So basically everything which is sacred to life, whether it's food, whether it's water, everything is being commodified.
And so you can see the ruling in 2003 ultimately forced Coca-Cola to pay damages for this. Then you shift over to New Guinea, and I just want to point out that this is not just about Coca-Cola. This is about all kinds of products coming into new markets. In New Guinea, they eat sweet potato, and they have tons of sweet potato everywhere. So people could always eat sweet potato. But rice companies want to be able to sell their rice. And so they hire the same actors that sell Coke to go into villages and try to convince people that rice is better for you than sweet potato. And once this happens, of course, people then have to sell their sweet potato to buy the rice in order to get what they think is better nutrition.
Their message about moving away from the traditional diet receives enthusiastic support.
So you can see how effective it is and how disturbing it is actually, because as most of you know, sweet potato is actually really healthy and every bit as healthy as rice. And yet here they are essentially cutting it down and saying if you really want to be muscular and strong and healthy, you have to eat rice. And so this is a way that these companies work, is they're trying to introduce their product cheaply, get people hooked on it, eliminate local alternatives. But ultimately what happens is they want to create desire. They want to create consumers. They want people who aren't satisfied with the same thing every day, like sweet potato Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and so on. They want to create consumers. So if we move to China, this has actually been very complicated for a couple of reasons. One is China has a long history of different philosophical traditions, some of which we'll talk about later, that don't emphasize consumerism. And furthermore, they have like tea culture, which is deeply embedded into their society. And so they're not likely to take on Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola has been battling this for quite some time, as you can see here.
In Asia, Coca-Cola faces tea cultures. There, the drinking of tea is a serious problem to them because every time someone drinks a cup of tea, they're not drinking a bottle of Coke.
Chinese tea culture is deeply rooted and integrated with all other forms of Chinese arts. Chinese calligraphy, Chinese painting, Chinese Peking opera. It doesn't matter what the song is, the essence is its lingering charm. And this is mingled with tea.
To spread its message, Coca-Cola is using the same marketing techniques banned during the Cultural Revolution. And it's targeting the part of China to whom Cultural Revolution means something quite different today. The kids. As elsewhere, many Chinese youth buy into the idea that you can achieve happiness by consumption. That's a new idea for the Chinese. But then, it once was for the folks in Rome, Georgia, too.
Reference to Rome, Georgia there is that people in Rome, Georgia, which is just down the street from Coca-Cola headquarters, actually drink more Coke than they do tap water. And that's kind of the ultimate goal. So this then is that shift that's happening. We're shifting from gifts to commodities to basically a consumer society. And the point here is that actually all of us have now been shifted to this consumer culture. Some people call this Coca-Colanization, just as a rip off of Coke's practices. But Coke is not the only one, right? This is happening. All companies are trying to move into new markets and do this kind of thing. But in a way, we're all Coca-Colanized, and we all have this bit of consumer culture in us. So, for example, advertisements deeply shape our identities and our happiness in ways that we often don't recognize. This started happening quite profoundly, like starting in the 50s and 60s and on into the 70s. And I just want to share some of that history with you. This is some of what was happening by the early 80s in terms of consumer culture, as advertisements started to shape our identities and happiness. This is going to be a psychologist talking about what she started to notice in the 1980s with her clients.
Something that I came to recognize in my work with patients, as they would talk about what their troubles were about their lives, occasionally they would refer to something they'd seen in a commercial, and I didn't really pay much attention to it until I had work with, I just call her Amy, it's not her real name, and she referenced that she wasn't part of the Pepsi generation at one point. She felt like she had never been part of the youth generation that was singing and dancing and having a fine time. Now she felt like she was too old to ever be part of the Pepsi generation. She was internalizing images from advertising and integrating that into a set of expectations about who she was supposed to be.
And some people have even suggested that consumer culture has now sort of replaced our highest ideals. So this is a sort of a mock painting here where we have Ronald McDonald at the center of the Last Supper, and Jesus is somewhere off to the side. But there's an anthropologist, Sidney Mintz, who's talked about this as well. And this is him talking about it here.
To the extent that that feeling has been replaced by the notion that you can build yourself over into what you want to be by consuming, to that extent, consumption has replaced an older ideology. If I drive a Mercedes-Benz, wear a Rolex watch, take my vacations in San Moritz, and otherwise demonstrate to the world the kind of person I am, the kind of person I am is the kind that consumes in that way. It says nothing about my character, it says nothing about my relationships to other people, but I have an identity that's been built up by companies. And yeah, that's where consumerism takes us. And it is, in this sense, a new religion.
See here the imagery. Joseph Campbell is a scholar of religion, once said that you could tell where society's values lie by looking for the tallest buildings. And if you went, say, to a medieval town, the tallest building would have been a church. And then by this 1800s, the tallest building would be the national capital, the state capital. And then by today, you look up and you see the tallest buildings are the corporations. And so in a way, our society's values have shifted away from religion and away from nationalism to consumerism. So by the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, this was already happening. And there were people unhappy about it, and they were rebelling against it. And these are the hippies, right? And it looked like they would be successful. They rejected all of society's values. And the biggest thing they rejected was consumerism. But Coke and Pepsi and other companies actually found a way to even market to this.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love.
But Coca-Cola's most important ingredient cannot be kept in a vault.
The white turtle doves.
The camera is panning to these happy, beatific faces. They're filled with the spirit.
And keep it company.
They're all very prayerful. There's a very strong conformity of purpose. It's uniting all peoples. There is one God, and that God is Coke.
So there's a big shift starts to happen here because the hippies reject all of these types of things. They reject all the advertising. They reject consumerism. But at the same time, what emerges through this cultural shift in the 70s is what's sometimes called the new individualism. So the new individualism is a shift in our culture that happened from the 60s to the 70s that sometimes people associate with hippies, but in fact took over our entire culture. And the piece of that is that we became much more individualistic at that time. So if you asked people in the 1950s whether they felt like they were important or whether they wanted to stand out, only about a very small handful would say they wanted to. About 3% of people in the 50s really desired to be an individual that stood out from the crowd. By the 1980s, that number was 80%. And so, in fact, even by 1970, the number was still 3%. In 1980, 80%. So there's a big shift in our society's values toward a new individualism. And that meant something different for how companies would market. And this is how consumer culture really started to change. So in the 1960s, you had this anti-consumerism rebellion among the hippies. But then technology changed, and we had faster, cheaper, flexible manufacturing, which meant that they could actually manufacture very specific things that weren't just sort of the same thing over and over again. They could manufacture a vast variety of cars, clothing, and all of this could happen very quickly. You could have very diverse, very specific products to market to very specific types of people. And so we ended up with what's called now post-demographic consumerism. It used to be that manufacturing was sort of slow and could only produce like one type of thing. And so people would market to young people, family people, and then older people. And that was pretty much what you could do. Now suddenly you could market to all kinds of people. You could market to people who had this type of style versus this type of style versus this type of style. And we end up with, by the 1980s, with what's called lifestyle marketing. This was a big change in how people thought about themselves as well. So these lifestyles, and this word lifestyle is actually relatively new, starting in the 70s and 80s. In the 1970s, the Stanford Research Institute instituted this word lifestyles and had created this sort of framework for thinking about lifestyles. I'm going to show you a video from the Stanford Research Institute, just a quick clip of it from from 1983. So all that can seem like really cheesy to us, like looking back at the 80s, but you started to see there how nuanced the marketing was becoming. And of course, it's much more nuanced now. Like with all of the information they have from our Facebook profiles, our Amazon purchases, and so on, they have these, over hundreds of categories for different types of people, and then can actually market to those very specific identities. So ultimately then we buy identity items to wear or consume. That becomes part of consumer culture. That first advertisements shape our identity. We have a sense that we need an identity, and then we go buy products to fulfill that identity in some way.
How did we get from this fairly simple role of the brand of the Aunt Jemima, the Quaker Oats, to these brand tribes that we have now, where we almost follow brands like we would follow rock stars? We organize ourselves into brand tribes. We are a Nike type of person or a Tommy Hilfiger type of person. How did that happen? There were a handful of brands that understood that marketing could play a larger role than simply branding their product as a mark of quality. They understood that they could sell ideas, that they could sell lifestyles. Coca-Cola, Disney, McDonald's, these core American brands became powerful precisely because they understood that they were selling ideas instead of products, that they were selling an idea about family. Coca-Cola was selling the youth lifestyle. In the 60s, they started selling peace and love. They were selling something way more profound than their fairly generic product, which was this black fizzy liquid.
So you can see this everywhere now, that companies are actually selling a lot more. They're selling like big ideas. Like Starbucks tends to try to sell community. Razors have nothing to sell, right? There's nothing new about any of these razors when they add like another blade. Like it actually doesn't matter. Like technologically it doesn't matter. But they try to make it seem like it matters. And so essentially they're selling like race cars. They're selling technology, even though the technology is kind of ridiculous. Like it really doesn't matter if your razor vibrates or not. Like it'll work just like any other razor. Nike will sell things like self-acceptance. Like this ad here is really selling you on the idea that it's all about self-acceptance. They sell courage and this persistence. They sell these big ideas about motivation. They want to align themselves with these ideas like this.
Well, the reason that advertising works is because the smart advertisers, at least, are trying to tie the consumption of their product to a message that suggests that your needs will be satisfied by consuming this thing. think of all of the car commercials you see that show, well, I've really made it now. I'm a competent person because I'm driving this BMW or this Audi. Or think of all the shampoo commercials you've seen where the person now has beautiful flowing hair and is loved and appreciated by the people around them. The basic message is the same. The way to solve the problems of your life, we all have problems in our life, the way to solve the problem in your life is through consumption.
So, you know, Coke has this open happiness idea that you can just open a Coke and open happiness. And so these are the ways that all these different ideas about the incomplete self or the alone self get created. And ultimately this is actually needed by advertisers. Advertisers need to create this sense inside of us so that then we consume. Consumption is largely driven by unhappiness, feeling incomplete, and so on. And so ultimately then consumer culture has this third element, and that is that we actually consume in order to connect. Now, I want to make this clear, like what this means and why it's so important. And that is that traditionally we would connect to consume. Like what I mean by traditionally is like through most of human history, humans created relationships with other humans so that they could protect each other, so that they could find food when they didn't have food themselves. Like my friends in New Guinea give and give and give and give, but by giving and giving and giving, they know that when they are out, like when they don't have food, when they hit a weak time in their garden, they can go to somebody who has a strong garden at that time and know that they'll get fed by them because they fed them in the last time that they were. And this becomes like a insurance system of sorts. But what we do is we actually consume in order to connect to other people. We consume to show people who we are so that somebody will look at us and say like, hey, that's cool, that's just like me, and then we feel connected in some way. And so this ultimately then drives consumerism. Like this idea of like, don't you want me now? Like we all have that sense of like, you know, buying something cool and then looking cool and then feeling like maybe somebody will want me now. Maybe I'll be able to connect with somebody now. Or just not even say romantically, but just even just like trying to show other people who are like us that we're also like them. But we have to do that through consumption. So here's a Coke commercial that sort of captures the essence of all this. Here Mr. Burns is kind of on his, kind of down and out. He walks into this place where everybody's connected, having a good time. And so here the product, the consumption, the commodity that is actually ripped apart community is presented as the solution. So it's, in a way, it's consumerism that took away our sense of community, but then they sell it back to us because, again, we all feel like something's missing, and perhaps if we just buy this stuff, we'll feel that sense of community again. So there is, though, a third part to this, and that is how things might be different. So here, back in the Kalahari, in that movie, there's sort of the metaphor of this here. They're talking about the Coke.
They began to talk about this thing that had come into their lives. They did not have a name for it. They called it the evil thing. He said, the thing does not belong on the earth. Tomorrow I will take it to the end of the earth and throw it off.
And he actually does. So at the end of the movie, you get this beautiful vision of him going on this long trek to throw the Coke bottle off the edge of the earth. But in reality, like, things are different. This is my brother in New Guinea, Lazarus, and I just want to show you a picture of him and how different his world is than ours. This is a picture of him with his newborn son, and so I can pretty well date this picture, and then I can look at this picture, and these are about 6 months apart, and you can see it's actually the same shirt, and I can also tell you that every day in between, he wore the same shirt. So he wore the same shirt every day for at least 6 months, and I could go to other pictures and get it out to about 9 months that he was wearing the exact same t-shirt every day without fail. And this is quite different than how we live. And this is because he lives in a gift economy where he's practicing minimalism rather than consumerism. So one of the things that happened was at the end of my trip to New Guinea, I'd been there for several years, And I took him and my other brother to the main town, and he had never been to the big town before. And so I promised that I would buy them some new clothes, that kind of thing. So we went to this shop, and my two brothers just like went around and around for hours, like looking for the right thing. And I couldn't figure out what they were looking for. And eventually he came out with this pack of soccer jerseys. They were unnumbered, and they were all the same. So it was basically like a 12-pack of shirts that were all exactly the same. And I asked him like why he wanted that, and he said, this way like nobody will ever think I have a new shirt. I'll be able to wear the same shirt for years. So he basically like would wear the same shirt and then switch it out and be able to wear the same shirt for years. And everybody would think like, oh, what a humble guy who's never changed his shirt for several years. And this is like what would constitute like kind of being a good person in a gift-based economy. Because if you were showing a different shirt every day, then you'd be expected to share those shirts and so on. So he was sort of gaming the system a little bit. You see the value of minimalism there. That's also on display here, as we showed earlier. Now, there's also other places in the world that have different ideas about these things that push back. So in India, in Hinduism, for example, there's this notion that you, as a self, you actually are connected to the world in a very intimate way. In fact, you are made up of the same stuff that the world is made up of. And they have these, in their creation story, the story is that originally there's just like this big mass that's everything, and that mass splits into two, and it eventually creates all the things of the world. And so the idea is that you are actually connected to everything in the world already, that you actually are the world already. And they have this type of saying that essentially says you already have what you are looking for. And this is this constant idea that runs through Hinduism, that you already have what you are looking for. And that, of course, is very anti-consumerist. It runs against our consumer notions. In Buddhism, they have these poems they called gathas. And every time they sit down to eat, a Buddhist will say something like, in this food, I see clearly the presence of the entire universe supporting my existence. So instead of this notion of an alone self, they constantly nurture this sense that they are connected to everything around them and everybody around them. So every piece of food is actually, truthfully, comes from the universe, and they just want to note that every time that they eat food. It's a way of showing gratitude and showing that and remembering their connection to the world. They also have this saying, it's sort of a mantra they will say that says, I have arrived, I am home. No matter where they are, they say this, and this is a way of saying that I'm complete, I'm not incomplete. I'm already home no matter where I am. And this, again, like runs against this sort of more consumerist mentality. And in China, they have this idea from Taoism where they want to simply accept what they call the self just so. That is, instead of always looking to the future of like who you might become, they have this idea of the self just so. And your goal in life is not to become something else and achieve something else, but instead just to accept yourself just so. But all of that said, there are a lot of changes happening in the world. And as you know, Shanghai is a very modernizing city, and there are a lot of forces happening throughout Asia. And on trendwatching.com, for example, just a couple years ago, they pointed out that post-demographic consumerism is now happening in Asia as well. So the same shift that we saw here about 40 years ago that we talked about today to lifestyle marketing is now happening in Asia as well, in even the most remote regions of Asia. And here you can see like a Levi's commercial from just a couple years ago in 2015. And traditionally, like Chinese New Year is a time for families to come together. Levi's realized that throughout China, a lot of young Chinese people were taking it as an opportunity to party like they see happening in the West. And so they're sort of advertising to that shift, that market. So these things are all up in the air in a way and changing constantly. But it's worth remembering at least that throughout most of human history, this idea of the incomplete self that most of us feel, it's not a universal, it's not something that's always been there. It's something that has been realized.